It was a late afternoon in the city. The streets were filled with the usual mix of cars, buses, and pedestrians rushing home from work. Streetlights were just starting to flicker on as the sun began its slow descent behind the tall buildings. The air carried the faint smell of exhaust, fast food, and the faint hint of rain that had passed earlier in the day. In the middle of this busy city, a man drove his car carefully, watching the traffic and following all the rules. He had spent the entire day at the office, going through files, attending meetings, and dealing with problems that seemed to never end. Now, he was just looking forward to getting home, having dinner, and resting. He was a well-dressed man, wearing a crisp shirt and a tie, looking every bit like a professional who took pride in his work. His car was clean and neat, reflecting his careful nature. He moved smoothly through the lanes, signaling on time, keeping his speed steady. He knew the city streets were unpredictable, but he trusted that staying cautious would get him home safely. From the other side of the street, a police officer was patrolling in a marked car. He had been on duty for hours, and his eyes scanned the streets constantly. He was alert, looking for anything suspicious, any vehicle moving slightly off the line, any person acting out of place. When he noticed the man driving, something about him caught the officer's attention. Perhaps it was the car. Perhaps it was the calm and focused expression on the man's face. But the officer made a quick decision. He decided to pull the man over. The officer flicked on his lights, and the familiar blue and red lights reflected off nearby buildings, flashing onto passing cars. The man saw the lights in his rearview mirror and immediately slowed down, carefully steering to the side of the road. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He hadn't sped, he hadn't swerved, and his car was in perfect condition. Still, he felt a small pit in his stomach. The familiar tension that always comes when a person is stopped by the police, even when they are innocent. He knew from experience that situations like this could be unpredictable, and he needed to stay calm. As he parked, the officer stepped out of his car, walking briskly toward him. There was a slight stiffness in the officer's movements, a rigidness. That spoke of authority, but also a certain impatience. He approached the window and tapped lightly on the glass, signaling for the man to roll it down. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said politely as he lowered the window. His tone was calm, measured, showing no hint of anger or fear. He knew that any sudden movements or sharp words could make the situation worse. "Is there a problem?" The officer looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "License and registration," he said, his voice firm. There was an edge to it, a sense that he expected trouble even before he knew anything about the man in front of him. The man handed over the documents without hesitation, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The officer studied the papers, his eyes moving over the license, the registration, the insurance card. He asked a few questions about where the man had been, why he was driving in this area, and if he had any recent tickets. The man answered each question clearly and politely, providing honest information without giving more than necessary. Despite his calmness, he could sense the tension in the officer's voice, the underlying suspicion that seemed to have no real reason. Around them, people continued with their day, though some glanced over at the stopped car. A few passers-by slowed down, curious about the interaction. The city had seen its share of traffic stops. Everyone knew that they could be routine or they could turn into something more. The officer leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice in a way that seemed intended to intimidate. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. His tone suggested he expected the man to hesitate, to stammer, to reveal guilt. "I'm not sure, officer," the man replied honestly. "I've been driving carefully. If I did something wrong, I'm happy to understand." His calmness was deliberate. He knew that showing anger or impatience would only escalate the situation. His words were polite, respectful, and neutral, keeping the officer from having any immediate reason to act aggressively. The officer paused, looking at the man carefully. There was something about his demeanor, calm, confident, unshakable, that seemed unusual. Most people would react nervously when stopped by the police. Most people would fidget, speak too quickly, or try to explain themselves before knowing what the officer had seen. But this man was different. He stayed composed, answering questions with steady, clear words, making direct eye contact without being confrontational. The tension between them grew slightly. The officer, still suspicious, began asking more pointed questions, his tone sharper now. "Have you been drinking? Any weapons in the car?" The man shook his head, his movements smooth and deliberate. "No, officer, no weapons, and I haven't had any alcohol today." Despite his politeness, the man could feel the underlying bias in the officer's approach. He noticed the way the officer's eyes lingered on him, subtle way his posture seemed defensive, ready for something to go wrong. The man did not react with anger. Instead, he reminded himself silently to stay calm, to handle the situation with patience, and to maintain control over his own actions. For a few moments they stood like this, words exchanged cautiously. The man could feel the officer's judgment weighing heavily, but he did not let it affect his tone or his composure. He understood the dynamics at play, the assumptions made. Too quickly, the rush to judgment, the influence of appearances on people's perceptions. He remained focused, knowing that staying calm was his strongest tool. Meanwhile, the officer seemed to struggle with a mix of authority and uncertainty. His instincts told him to be suspicious, but the man's calm presence made him pause. There was a small crowd beginning to gather on the sidewalk, people slowing down to watch the interaction unfold. The man noticed them briefly but did not let their attention distract him. He stayed focused on the conversation, responding clearly and respectfully. The city around them continued its rhythm. Cars honked softly in the distance. A bus rolled by slowly, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the concrete buildings. The sun had dipped lower now, painting the street in warm orange and pink hues. The lights of nearby stores began to glow, reflecting off the windshields and wet patches on the road from the earlier rain. The world moved on, but for the man and the officer, time seemed suspended, held in a fragile balance between authority and innocence. The officer finally asked for a closer look at the documents, taking a moment to scrutinize every detail. He flipped through the registration and insurance cards, reading names, addresses, and dates carefully. The man watched quietly, understanding that the officer needed to feel in control of the situation. He did not rush or speak unnecessarily, allowing the officer to complete his checks without interference. As the minutes passed, the man thought about how often situations like this could spiral out of control. He had seen stories in the news where minor stops escalated because someone lost their patience or reacted defensively. He reminded himself that staying calm, clear, and composed was not only the safest approach, but also the most effective. It allowed him to communicate clearly and ensured that the officer had no reason to act aggressively. Finally, the officer paused, looking at the man's face carefully. There was a flicker of doubt now, subtle recognition that this was not the type of person who would intentionally break the law or behave recklessly. The man maintained eye contact, calm and confident, waiting patiently for whatever the officer would do next. The man thought to himself that in moments like this, a person's character becomes visible, not in loud words or dramatic actions, but in the steady, measured way they handle pressure. He had worked hard to build a reputation of professionalism, respect, and calm under stress. And now, in a simple traffic stop, all of those qualities were being tested. The officer cleared his throat and asked a few final questions, his tone slightly softer now. The man answered each one without hesitation, calmly and politely. Even in the presence of bias and suspicion, he remained composed, proving through his actions that respect and patience could defuse tension. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the street, the officer finally seemed to hesitate. There was a moment of silence between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The man waited, knowing that how he handled the next few moments could determine whether this stop ended peacefully or escalated unnecessarily. He felt a mixture of relief and cautious alertness. Relief because he had not reacted impulsively, and cautious alertness because he knew the situation was not yet fully resolved. He understood that authority and assumptions could clash, and that only careful, respectful communication could navigate that space safely. Finally, the officer straightened slightly, preparing to continue his examination of the situation. The man adjusted his seat slightly, keeping his hands visible and relaxed, maintaining an air of calm authority, The interaction was far from over, but for now, the man had managed to hold his composure and face suspicion without fear or anger. The city moved on around them, but in that small stretch of street, time felt heavier. The tension of assumptions, authority, and patience hung in the air. And the man, calm and steady, waited for the moment when the truth of his identity and character would become clear. Ready to turn a routine stop into something more meaningful, both for himself and for the officer who had underestimated him. The officer leaned slightly against the patrol car, his eyes still fixed on the man sitting calmly behind the wheel. There was a small pause, a quiet moment where neither spoke, and yet the tension in the air felt almost tangible. The man kept his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed, eyes steady. He was aware of every movement around him, every slight shift in the officer's posture. He could sense the judgment, the assumptions, the impatience hidden behind a carefully controlled expression. "Do you live around here?" the officer asked after a moment, his voice sharper now, almost testing. It wasn't a friendly question. It was the kind of question that expected a lie, that expected hesitation. The man answered simply, without adding more than necessary. "Yes, a few blocks from here. I'm heading home now." The officer frowned, almost imperceptibly, as if that answer wasn't enough. He took a step closer to the car, glancing down at the documents again. "You've been driving for a while. Any reason for stopping and starting like that? Traffic violations? Speeding?" There was a subtle edge to his words, a challenge, suggestion that the man must be hiding something. "I've been driving carefully," the man said calmly. "I haven't had any issues. I try to follow all the rules." He spoke slowly, deliberately, ensuring his tone remained polite and non-threatening. He knew that raising his voice or showing irritation would only make the situation worse. He also knew that patience in moments like this could be powerful. Calm words often held more weight than anger. The officer's gaze lingered on him for a few seconds longer, his expression unreadable. Then he asked, "Have you been drinking at all today? Any medications? Anything that might impair your driving?" "No, officer," the man replied. "I haven't had alcohol, and I'm not on any medication that would affect me. I feel completely fine to drive." His voice was firm but neutral, showing confidence without aggression. He kept his eyes on the officer, steady and unflinching. He could see that the officer was waiting for a reaction, waiting for something to confirm the suspicion he had already decided upon. The officer's hand rested on his belt, his body tense. He glanced back toward his patrol car as if considering calling for backup. The man noticed the subtle hesitation and realized how quickly assumptions could escalate. He understood that the officer's bias was influencing his behavior, and he also knew that the next moments could determine whether this stop ended peacefully or turned into a confrontation. "Step out of the car," the officer said suddenly. His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. The man paused, taking a deep breath, then slowly opened the door and stepped out. His movements were calm, measured, showing no fear and no defiance. He kept his hands visible, relaxed at his sides. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown slightly, people curious but careful not to interfere. The officer asked him to put his hands on the roof of the car. The man complied immediately, placing his hands lightly on the metal surface. He felt the cool paint under his fingers and noticed the faint vibrations from the city traffic. He stayed still, breathing slowly, waiting for the officer to make the next move. He could feel the tension in the officer's stance. The way he shifted from one foot to the other, the subtle tightening of his grip on the belt. "Do you carry any weapons?" the officer asked, glancing around the man's body. His voice was low, controlled, but carried an unmistakable suspicion. "No, officer," the man answered. "I don't have any weapons." His tone remained calm, steady. There was no hesitation, no defensiveness. He understood that clear, direct answers could prevent misunderstandings. He also knew that over-explaining could be seen as suspicious, so he kept his responses concise. The officer seemed unconvinced. He circled the car slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle. He checked the windows, glanced inside, and moved to the back. The man watched quietly, aware that the officer's behavior was more about control than any real concern. He felt the subtle judgment. the assumptions based on appearances rather than facts. A few pedestrians had stopped further down the street. Some whispered to each other, curious about what was happening. The man ignored them, focusing entirely on the officer. He knew that staying composed in front of an audience was important. Any hint of anger, frustration, or fear could escalate the situation, and he wanted to avoid that entirely. Finally, the officer came around to the front of the car again. His eyes met the man's, and there was a brief, tense silence. The officer's expression was a mixture of authority and uncertainty, his mind processing what he had seen so far. The man, sensing this moment, kept his posture relaxed and his tone polite. "You're awfully calm for someone being stopped like this," the officer said, his voice carrying a subtle accusation. It was as if calmness itself was suspicious. "I believe staying calm helps in situations like this," the man replied. "It keeps things safe for both of us." His words were simple, yet they carried weight. There was no sarcasm, no hidden challenge, just honesty and clarity. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as if to emphasize authority. "Do you have anything to hide?" "No, officer," the man said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." His voice remained steady, showing confidence without aggression. He understood that standing firm on the truth, without confrontation, was the safest and most powerful approach. For a moment, the officer seemed to consider this, the tension in his posture easing slightly. Yet there was still a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, a reminder that bias and assumption were not easy to overcome. The man noticed it, understood it, and chose to remain silent. Letting the officer process the situation, the city continued to move around them. Cars drove past slowly, their drivers glancing at the scene with curiosity. The hum of conversation from nearby pedestrians filled the air, mixed with the distant sound of a bus engine and the occasional honk. The man focused only on the officer, aware that every gesture, every word, mattered in maintaining control of the encounter. Then, the officer asked the question that always caused a small internal shift. "Who do you work for?" His tone was suspicious, expecting hesitation or evasion. "I work in law enforcement," the man said simply. "I handle internal affairs investigations." He kept his voice calm, measured, revealing the truth without any boast or challenge. He could see the officer's eyes flicker, a brief moment of hesitation, but he did not react to it. He continued to stand with his hands on the car, relaxed, yet authoritative. The officer's posture changed subtly. There was a flicker of recognition, though he didn't say anything immediately. The man noticed the moment, but he did not let it affect his composure. He understood that authority could be intimidating and bias could cloud judgment. But patience and clarity often helped dissolve tension. The officer cleared his throat and stepped back slightly. His tone less sharp now, but still controlled. "Internal affairs, huh?" he said slowly. "So you investigate other officers?" "Yes," the man replied calmly. "I oversee investigations into police conduct, ensuring that rules are followed and misconduct is addressed. My role is to make sure everyone is held accountable." His words were firm but not confrontational. He stood with confidence, showing that he respected the law and his responsibilities. The officer's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, there was a flicker of realization in his expression. The suspicion that had guided his actions began to fade, replaced by surprise, and maybe a little embarrassment. He had assumed guilt based on appearances, and now he understood that assumption had been wrong. Around them, a small crowd of pedestrians shifted quietly, sensing the change in energy. The tension that had hung thickly in the air began to ease, replaced by curiosity and a subtle sense of relief. The man remained composed, aware that the encounter was far from over, but confident that the situation was moving toward a resolution. You're in internal affairs?" the officer asked, his voice uncertain now. He looked down at the documents again, double-checking the credentials, as if seeing them would confirm what he had just learned. "Yes, officer," the man said simply. "I am, and I take my role very seriously. That's why I stay calm and follow procedure in situations like this. It ensures safety and fairness for everyone involved." His words were clear and measured, emphasizing both professionalism and integrity. The officer shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the assumptions he had made. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it, unsure of what was appropriate. The man remained still, calm, and patient, giving the officer space to process the revelation. It was a moment of reflection for both of them. The officer realized how quickly bias had influenced his actions, how assumptions had clouded his judgment, and how easily a simple traffic stop could have escalated unnecessarily. The man, on the other hand, recognized the power of patience, clarity, calmness in diffusing tension and maintaining control. The street around them continued to hum with activity. Cars passed by, pedestrians whispered quietly, and the sounds of the city remained steady. Yet in this small corner of the street, something subtle had shifted. The encounter, which had begun with suspicion and tension, was now moving toward understanding and awareness. The man adjusted his posture slightly, relaxed his shoulders, and waited for the officer to speak next. He had maintained his composure through every question, every assumption, and every challenge. And now, with the revelation of his role in internal affairs, he knew that the interaction could finally move toward a resolution. The officer blinked, his eyes widening slightly as he looked again at the man standing calmly beside his car. The words had hit him like a jolt he hadn't expected. Internal affairs. He had assumed so many things in the last few minutes. Assumed guilt, assumed disrespect, assumed danger, but now, those assumptions were crumbling in front of him. The man's calm, composed demeanor no longer seemed ordinary. It carried a weight of authority and experience that the officer hadn't anticipated. For a moment, the officer simply stared. He felt a strange mix of surprise, embarrassment, and uncertainty. He had treated this as a routine stop, a small moment of authority, yet here he was, confronted with someone whose role was to oversee and investigate police conduct. He could feel the weight of his own bias pressing down on him, and the sudden awareness of how wrong his assumptions had been made him uneasy. The man noticed the shift instantly. He didn't rush to speak, didn't gloat or assert dominance. He simply kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his voice calm and measured when he finally said, "Officer, I understand why you stopped me. It's your duty to ensure the streets are safe. But assumptions based on appearance or circumstance can lead to serious misunderstandings." The officer swallowed, his throat dry for a moment. He hadn't expected to be confronted with this perspective, especially not from someone he had just presumed to be a routine driver. He began, but his words faltered. He searched for the right thing to say, but realized that no quick excuse could erase the assumptions he had carried in his mind. "You don't need to explain," the man continued gently. "I know it isn't easy to admit when you've misjudged someone, but understanding that bias can influence our actions is the first step toward doing better. It keeps everyone safer, including you and me." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was firm, professional, and calm, almost as if he were teaching a lesson rather than confronting the officer. The officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the small crowd that had formed a few meters away. He could feel the eyes of strangers, witnesses to his mistake, and the embarrassment pressed on him like a physical weight. In his mind, he replayed the last few minutes, the quick assumptions, the sharp tone, the readiness to escalate, and he realized how easily things could have gone wrong. He had almost let bias guide his actions, and now he saw it clearly. "Okay," said finally, his voice quieter than before. I didn't mean you didn't intend to assume," the man said. "But intention doesn't always matter. Actions do. And right now, we have a chance to act with fairness and respect." His eyes met the officer's steadily. "That's what matters more than anything else in this moment." The officer nodded slowly, his face still tense. He felt a mix of relief and shame. Relief that the situation had not escalated, and shame that he had allowed assumptions to guide his actions so quickly. He realized how easily people could be judged unfairly, and how dangerous it could be to treat someone differently based solely on appearance. The man noticed the subtle shift in the officer's demeanor and decided to continue calmly. giving him the space to process what had just been revealed. "I want to make it clear," he said. "I'm not here to punish or lecture you. I'm here to remind everyone that fairness, patience, and respect matter, especially in moments where authority meets everyday life." The officer's hands, which had been clenched loosely at his sides, relaxed slightly. He took a small step back from the car, almost unconsciously acknowledging the man's position without needing to say anything. The tension in his shoulders eased, though the lingering embarrassment remained. You really work in internal affairs?" the officer asked, his voice sounding uncertain. It's almost like a question he needed to hear answered to make sense of what had just happened. "Yes," the man replied calmly. "I oversee investigations into police conduct, ensuring that rules are followed and that everyone is treated fairly. My role is to protect both the public and law enforcement officers by holding everyone accountable." The officer's eyes widened slightly again, and he looked down at the documents one more time, double-checking the information. He saw the badge, the title, and the official credentials, confirming what the man had just said. It was real. He had been stopped by someone whose job was to oversee the conduct of officers like him, someone who held authority he hadn't expected. For a brief moment, the officer felt a rush of conflicting emotions: surprise, respect, and shame. He realized how quickly assumptions had influenced his behavior, how easily bias could cloud judgment, and how dangerous it could be in situations where authority and trust intersected. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The man, sensing the shift, maintained his calm stance, letting the moment sink in. He didn't need to raise his voice or assert dominance. His presence, his words, and his calm authority were enough to make the officer reflect deeply. The man's professionalism in a situation that could have escalated into conflict was a quiet, but powerful lesson in itself. "I see now," the officer said finally, his voice low and sincere. "I should have approached this differently." "You're already seeing it," the man replied gently. "The fact that you recognize it is important. It means you have the chance to do better next time, to approach every stop and every encounter with fairness, patience, and respect. That's what makes a real difference, not just here, but everywhere you interact with people." The small crowd that had gathered around them shifted slightly, sensing the tension dissolved. A few whispered to each other, but the atmosphere was no longer one of suspicion and confrontation. It was a quiet, reflective moment that held lessons far beyond the street where it was happening. The officer took a deep breath and nodded again. I acted too quickly. I let assumptions get in the way. I see that now. Awareness is the first step," the man said. "Acting on that awareness makes the difference. You have the ability to improve, to ensure that every stop, every encounter is handled with fairness. That's what your role demands, and that's what keeps trust alive between the community and law enforcement." The officer looked at him, his expression slowly shifting from tension to a mix of understanding and humility. He realized that this encounter had taught him something he hadn't learned in training or on the streets. Real authority wasn't about assuming guilt or asserting power. It was about fairness, patience, and careful judgment. The man, sensing that the officer was beginning to internalize the lesson, decided to bring closure to the stop without further escalation. "I know this has been tense," he said calmly, "and I want to thank you for being willing to listen. That willingness matters more than anything else right now." The officer nodded, his hands now fully relaxed at his sides. "Thank you for your patience," he said quietly. I acted wrong. I see that now." "It's okay," the man said, keeping his voice steady and kind. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and ensure that our actions reflect fairness and integrity moving forward." There was a brief pause, a quiet moment where both men simply looked at each other. The tension that had hung heavily in the air was gone, replaced by a subtle understanding. The officer was no longer just a figure of authority exercising power. He was someone learning, reflecting, and considering how to do better. The man was no longer just a driver being stopped. He was a professional ensuring accountability, calmly demonstrating the value of patience and integrity. The city around them continued its rhythm, Cars passed, pedestrians walked along the sidewalks, and distant sounds of traffic and conversation filled the air. Yet in that small stretch of street, time felt almost suspended. A lesson had unfolded quietly, without drama or confrontation. Simply through patience, professionalism, and calm authority, the officer cleared his throat. A small gesture signaling both acknowledgement and humility. I'll be more careful. I'll approach stops differently in the future, he said. I understand now how quickly assumptions can affect judgment. That's all anyone can ask for, the man replied. Awareness, reflection, and action are what create real change. Keep that in mind every time you interact with someone, especially when you have authority over them. The officer nodded once more, his posture finally fully relaxed. There was a subtle shift in his energy, a recognition that bias could be challenged, and that understanding could replace assumption. The man had not raised his voice, had not become confrontational, yet he had delivered a powerful lesson simply by remaining calm, professional, and respectful. The man returned to his car slowly, opening the door and stepping inside. He sat down, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and gave a small, courteous nod to the officer. Thank you, he said simply. I hope this stop helps us both do better. The officer stepped back, his expression thoughtful. He watched the man settle into his car, and for the first time, he truly reflected on how important fairness, patience, and integrity were in every interaction. The assumptions that had guided his actions moments ago were gone, replaced by a quiet determination to act more responsibly in the future. As the man started the car and prepared to drive away, the officer called out softly, "Drive safely." "I will," the man replied, his tone calm and reassuring. He signaled and merged carefully into traffic, continuing his journey home. The encounter was over, yet its lessons lingered, both for the officer who had acted too quickly and for the man who had handled the situation with grace and authority. The man drove slowly down the street, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. His mind replayed the encounter over and over, not out of frustration, but out of careful reflection. It had been a tense situation, one that could have gone in many different directions, and yet it had ended with understanding. He had maintained his composure, kept his focus, and turned what could have been a conflict into a quiet lesson about fairness and professionalism. He thought about the officer, wondering how deeply the encounter would affect him. In those few minutes, the officer had been confronted not with anger or blame, but with calm authority and reason. The man knew that such moments could plant seeds of awareness, slowly growing into real change. Bias, assumptions, and quick judgments could be challenged, but only if someone stayed patient and clear. He hoped the officer would remember this, not just for his own sake, but for the safety and fairness of everyone he would encounter in the future. As he drove, the man reflected on the power of presence and patience. Authority alone was not enough to create respect or understanding. It was how a person carried themselves, how they communicated, and how they upheld fairness that truly mattered. He had seen too often how quick judgments could escalate, how fear and assumptions could lead to unnecessary tension, and how a lack of patience could turn small encounters into dangerous ones. Today, he had managed to prevent that simply by staying composed and professional. The city around him hummed with activity. Cars moved steadily through the evening traffic. Streetlights glowed along the sidewalks, and pedestrians hurried home or to evening plans. He noticed details that were easy to miss in moments of stress, the soft reflection of light on wet pavement, the distant sound of children laughing, the faint aroma of food from a nearby restaurant. Life continued, indifferent to the small drama that had just unfolded on that street. Yet it carried its lessons quietly forward. He thought about how many people in the city never experienced such encounters firsthand. Some might assume that stops like these were routine or inconsequential, but he knew better. Every encounter carried weight. Every interaction between authority and a civilian could affect trust, perception, and safety. Today had been an opportunity to influence that balance, to turn a potentially negative moment into a chance for awareness and learning. He also reflected on the officer's reaction. There had been no anger, no resentment, only a slow, dawning realization of the assumptions he had made. It was not an easy thing to admit one's own mistakes, especially when authority was involved. Yet the officer had done it, even if quietly and subtly. Awareness was often the first step toward real change, and he hoped that this small encounter would ripple out in ways that were hard to measure. The man slowed at a traffic light, taking the moment to breathe and reset his thoughts. He considered how patience and calmness had been his most powerful tools. He had answered questions honestly, followed instructions without hesitation, and maintained a steady demeanor throughout. Those simple actions, often overlooked, had kept the situation from escalating. It was a reminder that power was not only in titles or authority, but in the way one carried themselves under pressure. As he continued his drive, his phone buzzed gently on the passenger seat. He glanced at it, seeing a few messages from colleagues and family. He ignored them for the moment, focusing instead on the quiet aftermath of the encounter. Moments like these, he knew, were rarely dramatic, but they were important. They were lessons in restraint, understanding, and professionalism, lessons that would stay with him, and perhaps with others involved. He thought about the larger implications. How bias could influence daily life in subtle ways. It was not always overt or aggressive. Sometimes it was as simple as a tone, a glance, or an assumption. The officer's actions, though unintentional in their bias, reflected a pattern that many people experienced regularly. By staying composed, he had demonstrated an alternate way to respond, without escalating, without fear, without anger. It was a quiet form of power, one that relied on integrity and patience rather than authority alone. Pulling into his neighborhood, he noticed the familiar sights: the small park at the corner, the grocery store with its glowing sign, the street lamp that flickered faintly at the end of the block. He felt a sense of relief, not because the encounter was over, but because it had ended well. It was a reminder that even in a world where assumptions and quick judgments were common, calmness and professionalism could make a meaningful difference. He parked in his driveway and sat for a moment, letting the engine run quietly. The evening air was cool and still, carrying the faint sounds of the city beyond his street. He thought about the officer again, hoping that the realization he had sparked would lead to change in how stops and interactions were handled in the future. He knew that the officer, like many people, would remember the calm authority and professionalism he had shown. And that memory might influence decisions in countless, small ways over time. The man stepped out of the car and closed the door softly. Taking a deep breath of the cool evening air, he thought about the lessons embedded in the encounter awareness of bias, patience in tense situations, and the importance of maintaining integrity under pressure. These were not just lessons for the officer or for himself. They were lessons for everyone who might find themselves in moments of conflict, uncertainty, or misunderstanding. As he walked toward his front door, he reflected on how small acts could have a large impact. One calm conversation, one steady response, one honest and professional approach could ripple outward in ways that were hard to see, but meaningful nonetheless. He understood that life was full of these moments, encounters that could escalate or de-escalate depending on the choices made in seconds. Today had been one such moment, and he had chosen carefully. He entered his home quietly, greeted by the soft hum of evening routines. Lights dimmed in the living room, the faint scent of dinner, the sound of a television in another room. He placed his keys on the table and sat for a moment, reflecting on the day, the encounter, and the lessons carried forward. It was a quiet evening, but it held the weight of awareness and reflection. The man thought about the broader picture: the city, the streets, and the countless people moving through their lives. Many would never see the moments where assumptions and bias could shape an interaction. Many would never feel the relief of a tense encounter resolved through calm professionalism. Yet these moments existed, quietly shaping perceptions, understanding, and the potential for change. He had experienced one of those moments, and it reinforced the importance of patience, clarity, and integrity in every action. He also considered the subtle human side of the encounter. The officer had been uncomfortable, embarrassed, and uncertain, yet he had listened, reflected, and absorbed a lesson without confrontation. That human capacity to recognize mistakes and adjust behavior was fragile but powerful. It was a reminder that fairness and understanding could ripple quietly through the world, influencing behavior in ways that were slow but meaningful. Dinner that evening was quiet and simple. He ate slowly, savoring the food and the calm that followed the tension of the day. He thought about how easily small moments of bias could create larger consequences, and how critical it was to approach life with awareness and patience. The encounter had been a microcosm of larger dynamics assumptions: authority, fairness, and respect, and it had been resolved not through confrontation, through steady professional conduct. After dinner, he sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The streets were still busy with traffic and life, but the lessons of the evening remained vivid. He thought about how he could carry those lessons forward in his own work, in his interactions with colleagues, and in moments of authority and responsibility. Awareness, he realized, was just the beginning. Acting on that awareness, maintaining patience, and holding integrity were the ongoing challenges that defined true professionalism. He reflected on how the encounter could serve as an example, not just for the officer or for himself, but for anyone watching or hearing the story later. Moments of tension could be transformed into lessons of awareness and fairness. Assumptions could be challenged through calm authority and professionalism. Patience and respect could prevent unnecessary escalation in countless situations every day. The man thought about the officer one last time before closing his eyes for the night. He hoped the officer would remember the calm, composed presence he had witnessed, the measured responses, and the clarity with which the situation had been handled. Perhaps it would influence the officer's behavior in future stops, future interactions with the public, and even in private reflections on bias and fairness. It was a quiet hope, but a meaningful one. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt a sense of closure. The tension of the stop was gone, replaced by reflection, awareness, and calm. The day's challenges had been met, the encounter resolved, and the lessons clear. Authority, fairness, and patience had prevailed in a moment that could have been fraught with conflict. And in that, there was quiet satisfaction, a sense that the world could move forward a little more justly. One interaction at a time, the city outside continued its rhythm into the night. Lights blinked on buildings, cars moved through quiet streets, and the faint hum of distant voices and activity carried through the air. The man slept, but the lessons of the day lingered, subtle and powerful reminders of how one calm, patient, and professional approach could make a real difference in the world, and in that quiet, unremarkable corner of the city. A small but meaningful moment had changed the course of understanding, awareness, and respect, leaving both the man and the officer with a lesson that would extend far beyond the street where it began.